to be a resource or a help to families. I have not seen that play out so much in my experience. What I've seen play out is more of them being a stress and a really harmful part of people's lives. So that's kind of some of the language I'm going to be using, and using words like family policing or family regulation to describe the actions that they take. And how do they do it? So how do they engage in these activities? A big function of what they do is investigation, but then they also do kind of ongoing involvement, or what a lot of people call an open case, having an open case with DCF. And that's kind of long-term involvement with DCF, where they're monitoring your family, checking up to make sure you're doing right by your kids, you're taking them to the pediatrician, you're feeding them, being able to talk to any professionals, quote unquote, involved with your family. That's another one of their huge functions. And then obviously the one that most people know about who haven't come in contact with them, which is the power to put kids in foster care. So they also, obviously maintain foster homes, group homes, and other levels of out of home or out of a family of origin placement. All right, Brianna, if you can go to the next slide. So here's just some important background in terms of statistics. There's an excellent report that was done by the American Civil Liberties Union and Human Rights Watch, which just came out last year in 2022, that said over half of Black children in America will be subject to a child welfare investigation or a family policing investigation before they turn 18. So they're going to come in contact with these systems, and the system looks different in every state. Sometimes you'll hear the word CPS used, or Child Protection Services, to kind of talk about the system at large. In Boston, which is where I am located, Black children are reported into the system, meaning reports are filed on Black kids 8.9 times the rate of white children, and Latinx kids are reported 6 times more than white children. That's in the Boston area. And this, similar racial disparities exist in other parts of our state. And if you go to the next slide, actually just this week, in the news, in the Boston Globe, there was an article that talked about Latino children being more likely to enter foster care in Massachusetts than any other state, based on statistics. And this was just literally this week, 3 days ago, in the Boston Globe. So accompanying this article was a little video that we're going to play, just because I think it provides some good overview of some of the issues facing the department right now. Oh, it might not let us play it. That's okay, Brian. I might have to do it later because it's an outside link, I think. We'll get that queued up later. I'm going to talk a little bit more about data just before we get into kind of more of know your rights and what happens in an investigation. So these numbers that you see on the screen are all from DCF's annual report. So every year they have to put out a report giving an overview of what they've done with respect to families in Massachusetts. So you'll see at the top, there were, for the past fiscal year of 2022, over 90,000 calls made to DCF.
Wow.
So those are what you'll probably hear a lot of called 51A reports. There's been a 51A called in, and that 51A number actually references the number of the law that enables reports to be filed, or requires reports to be filed, I should say. And then you see right underneath the 90,000 that have happened last fiscal year, about 46% of them were screened out. They weren't even investigated. 54% were investigated, so that's on the left-hand side where it says screened in, and we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about screen in, screen out. But of those ones that were screened in and they actually did an investigation, only 41% were supported, 17% fell in this middle ground category that's called substantiated concern, and then 42% were unsupported. So all of those people, though, of those 39,571 folks, families, were investigated. There was a 51B response, is the language that DCF uses. And then you see on the right-hand side of the statistics, the majority of those support decisions, when DCF says, yes, there have been supported allegations of abuse or neglect, 86.6% of those supported responses, of those 16,000 support decisions, were for neglect, not for abuse. So I think most people, when they think about DCF or they think about CPS, they're thinking about abuse. They're thinking about parents who actively abuse their children, either intentionally or by, really gross negligence, and the children have ended up harmed or they've been sexually abused. As you see, there's only 10% of those support decisions that were physical abuse, 5.1% that were substance-exposed newborns, and then 4.8%, the least amount, were sexual abuse. So wow. A big critique of this system is that there are way too many folks getting drawn into the system for issues of neglect, which are in a large part related to conditions of poverty in communities, and families not being able to provide access to services for children, access to concrete resources for children, not being able to provide for childcare because you can't afford it, leaving your kid home because you can't pay for a babysitter, but you need to go to work, not having a coat for your child because you couldn't afford to buy one, things like this. And there's more, obviously, that falls into that neglect category, but this is part of kind of the national conversation that's happening right now is, why is DCF becoming involved with so many families for neglect, not for what most people think they get involved for, which is abuse? So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so who is actually filing all these reports? Like, where are those 90,000 reports coming from? Why is it 90,000 reports? Well, anonymous people can call the DCF hotline and make a report. The majority of those reports are coming from mandated reporters. And those are people required by law to file reports. And those are school personnel, childcare providers, medical professionals, mental health and social workers. So some of you in this Zoom may be mandated reporters, law enforcement, and clergy. The Office of the Child Advocate has unrolled a new statewide mandated reporter training that some of you may not even have taken yet because it's fairly new, to try to kind of make more routine what that training looks like, to try to decrease the number of reports that are not necessary, and focus in on why and when people should do reporting. So it's yet to be seen how this standardized training is going to make an impact. But this website that I reference at the bottom of the slide has kind of a standard training for each one of those different buckets of people who are required. So what are they required to report? So this is the actual language of the law in 51A, that they're required, a mandated reporter in their professional capacity, when they have reasonable cause to believe a child is suffering physical or emotional injury resulting from the things you see there. Abuse inflicted on them, which causes harm or substantial risk to harm, neglect, including malnutrition, physical dependence upon an addictive drug at birth. And I'll put a star next to that one because there's been some efforts to change that, but being a sexually exploited child or being a human trafficking victim. So this is what the law says folks have to report. Like, this is what's telling people what they need to do. It's not very specific, right? Like, it doesn't give a decision tree to tell people, okay, if there's this issue, then you should file or not file. So that's what that kind of training is allegedly supposed to kind of fill in those blanks. All right, next slide. I'm just going to pause for 1 second because I'm about to go into like another section and just open up for any brief questions. Anyone have any questions at this point? No. Okay, great. I'm glad everything's fairly clear, I hope. So what is the timeline? What does an investigation actually look like? And again, this is likely, you're going to hear the language response, DCF response, because they don't want to use the word investigation. I encourage you to think of it as an investigation. And more than just thinking of it as an investigation, I want you to think of it as an evidence collecting mechanism. It's not a benign kind of like, we're just trying to figure out how to help the family. It's really for the purposes of collecting evidence for the department. So after someone makes a report, again, usually one of those mandated reporters, it goes to step number 2 on this timeline, which is screening. Screening is where DCF decides whether they're going to investigate or not. So that, if you remember from that a couple of slides ago, there was that kind of big number at the top, the 90,000, and then it was broken out. Over almost half, it's kind of like a half and half, 54 were screened in, 46 were screened out, were screened out. So there's a huge number of those reports that don't even get investigated. And some of the reasons those investigations may not happen are there's requirements for the cases that DCF can actually investigate. They have to be allegations against a caretaker of the child. That doesn't have to be a parent or anyone with a blood relationship. But if they're in a caregiving role of a child, so if it's not a caretaker that's being alleged to have done something with the child, that may get referred to the DA's office or referred to the police for investigation, but it wouldn't be DCF doing the investigation. DCF doesn't do investigations on non-children. They're the agency that does investigations on children. So if it's a non-child, meaning someone over 18 who's being reported, they're not going to do an investigation. If it's an elderly person, that's not their department. They don't do that. So you can see there's a number of reasons why. There's also several reasons, like there's not enough information in the report to even identify who's involved or what's going on. Vague reports. There's a lot of reasons that reports get screened out. But fair to say that, over half get screened in. So that gets us to the investigation timeline. DCF has to make a decision in that screening decision-making period. Is this an emergency or is it a non-emergency? So those are the kind of 2 buckets they have to filter cases. And that does matter in terms of perceived seriousness of the case to DCF. The higher risk that they perceive based on the report that they have, the more likely that they're going to screen in as an emergency response. So that's a 5 working day turnaround. If they don't feel like it's an emergency, there's no immediate risk to children, they're going to screen it in as a non-emergency, a 15-day working day turnaround. And when I say turnaround, that's for them to conduct their investigation and come out with their decision, which is also called a determination. So anytime during this investigation phase, even in the first 24 hours, even in the first 10 hours, they can remove a child from a parent or caregiver's custody. They do not have to go to court to do that. Under the law, under 51B, they have the ability to exercise emergency authority, essentially, to take children away from their caregivers. So that's why there's kind of been an outcry. You may have heard some in the media about the fact that there's very few cases where DCF actually goes to court to ask for court permission to take a child. And this varies by state. So in some states, it's very common that there'll be court involvement before taking a child. In other states, it's very common where usually the event that gets you into court is a child being taken. So it's very state specific. Here in Massachusetts, it's very common that the removal of a child, the taking of a child by the department is what initiates court involvement. And that'll matter later on for different reasons that I'll get to. So going to go to the next slide. Okay, so what do they do in an investigation? Excuse me. It's not kind of a hidden secret what they do. They have a policy. It's called the Protective Intake Policy that governs what they do in an investigation. It's how they train the investigators. And the reason why I kind of encourage people to think about this as an evidence gathering mission for DCF and to think of it as an investigation rather than a response is if you look at this list of things that DCF does, it's very much an evidence gathering mission. They're trying to gather evidence to either support allegations of abuse or neglect or unsupport them or put them in that squishy middle category of substantiated concern. So they'll review DCF history. So that includes not just, prior reports that may have been on that parent or caregiver or child. They'll also review a parent's history as a child with the department. So you will see when they conduct this investigation, if a parent was in DCF or involved with DCF as a child themselves when they were a child, that will ping in this kind of review of DCF history. There's not many ways to kind of expunge or seal or erase from DCF's case files people's contact with them. It kind of lives forever for a lot of bad reasons and some, by the proponents of that approach, good reasons to say that we're able to see, when people have harmed children or put children at risk, but it's very hard to kind of get rid of that history. We'll talk about some ways to do that, but that's that first level. They're definitely going to do Corey checks, that's for sure. Usually, sometimes they'll do them just on the people who are alleged to have done something to a child, but they'll also often run Corey checks on non-reported other adults in the home. So there's other adults living in the home. They'll often run Corey checks on those folks too. They'll request information if there's been police responses to the home. They'll do online searches, another reason to have all of your social media on lockdown so DCF can't look at it because they really do love to get into people's social media. They request information from other states with respect to kind of involvement, CPS involvement in other states. They visit the reported child, and the reported child is the child who is the subject of the 51A report. They will visit and interview all children, though, in addition to who are in the home, living in the home, even if they're not the reported child. So oftentimes I'll have parents be like, why are they interviewing my 6-year-old when the allegation was on my 16-year-old? Well, per their policy, they say we have to interview all the children, visit and interview all the children, including even the non-reported child. They need to visit the home. And again, I'm going to put an asterisk there and talk a little bit about that more in depth later. But they need to visit the home, and that visit to the home looks like a home inspection. They're going to check people's cabinets for food. They're going to look at the sleeping arrangements. Sometimes they poke around in people's medicine cabinets and like to see kind of what medications people are on. And, if you have alcohol bottles over your fridge, or if you, have a sink full of dishes or piles of laundry or anything that exists in a lot of folks' home, that's going to be noted in their inspection. They're going to interview the alleged person responsible for the alleged abuse or neglect. And another star there, we're going to get to kind of in the Know Your Rights part of this, what that could look like or could not look like. They're going to get information on collaterals. So who are collaterals? Collaterals are anyone involved in the family. We're talking pediatricians, family members, neighbors, supportive or non-supportive people. But they'll ask for names and numbers of folks, where the kids go to school, where they get their medical care, etc. And they'll contact those collaterals for information. So a pretty exhaustive list of evidence gathering techniques. You want to go to the next slide, Brianne? Okay, so this is kind of the emerging an emerging area of legal representation that's as a result of some federal funding is getting more and more embedded into the community, hopefully more so, but that's part of the work we do, is to provide people access to lawyers during investigation. As you can see, there's many, many, many points where folks will probably want to talk to a lawyer. And it would be great that everyone who came into contact with DCF had access to talk to that lawyer as soon as DCF knocks on the door and says, "Hi, I'm here about a report." That would be wonderful. We don't have that system yet, right? Like, most folks are only getting lawyers with DCF after their kids have been taken away and they're in court with DCF, or DCF has filed a case on their family but not yet taken their kids away, but they're still involved in court, and kind of this heightened level of case where DCF's like, "We're going to get the judge to tell you that you have to do X, Y, or Z, or else we will take your kids." And folks are getting court-appointed lawyers in those situations. So I was one of those court-appointed lawyers. Some of the other folks in the Zoom may be court-appointed lawyers. And those folks range, obviously, like any other public defense bar, like the criminal defense bar, like the mental health bar, like all of the different groups of lawyers. There's great ones, and then there's not so great ones, and you have everything in between. I don't want to like kind of paint everyone with a broad brush, but it's definitely pretty common in my practice that I hear from folks who are saying, "My lawyer isn't getting back to me," or "I can't get in touch with my lawyer. They're not doing anything for me with DCF, or they're not coming to my meetings." And, there's a lot of, and I'm sure Kayla can affirm a lot of, from a peer support perspective, a lot of different experiences folks have with lawyers, and happy to answer questions in the question and answer more about that. But I want to focus in on kind of what the rights are here. In Massachusetts, DCF is not required to give you a list of your rights when interacting with them. They will give a pamphlet to families saying like who DCF is, and they'll say you have a right to have like a loved one or a family friend or a friend present when they interview you. Buried in a different document, it actually says you have a right to have a lawyer present. But they're not very forthcoming with the fact that people have rights. And, from the perspective of DCF, they have a very short amount of time. Again, I'm no spokesperson for them, obviously, but they have a very short amount of time to conduct their investigation. And if people start asserting their rights and kind of pushing back on DCF, it's going to be hard for them to conduct that investigation. There's going to be roadblocks and hoops they have to jump through, and it's not going to be as easy for them to get the information they want and need to conduct their investigation. And I think it is important to mention at this point, like, remember, a good number of these cases go unsupported. So folks are giving over information to DCF even without attorneys and getting their cases unsupported. So it's not all doom and gloom, but I think it's also the point I want to emphasize is there are things to know about how DCF operates that can help you help yourself, essentially, during that process. So one of those things is to limit what you tell DCF, and there's an option there to refuse to speak with them entirely. The point at which DCF enters into someone's life is a completely voluntary process. But it's a voluntary process with a really, really big hammer hanging over it, right? Like, they have the power to take somebody's child away, and they will exercise that power, right? They'll tell people, "I have the power to take your kid away. Like, you got to cooperate in this investigation, or else I'm going to go to court and get a court order for you to cooperate, or I'm going to say you're uncooperative and take your kid." So there's a really big consequence, right? So most people choose to cooperate with DCF, and a lot of people feel like, I have nothing to hide, I have done nothing wrong, this is some random allegation, or I know the person who made this and they're just out to get me, or whatever it may be. People have a very natural urge to want to tell their story, want to tell their side of things. So the option to refuse entirely is there, but a lot of people don't exercise it for good reasons, right? For a fear that that's not going to go so well for me, right? And I think that's a well-grounded fear, right? It's a well-grounded fear, and it's a rational thing to proceed with DCF. Certainly, though, if somebody is being investigated in Wellesley or some wealthy white suburban neighborhood, the minute DCF knocks on their door, they're hiring a private attorney, and the private attorney is shutting that down and saying, you can't speak with my client. Don't speak with my client without me present. You're not saying anything to them. So there's a really huge disparity in kind of how communities of color, how people living on the margins in different communities are experiencing DCF, and how the lesser of the cases, but they still exist in privileged communities and, white and affluent communities are experiencing DCF. So people can refuse also to let DCF into their home. So I talked kind of in the context of the investigation, calling it a home search. And I did that intentionally because the police are not allowed to conduct a home search without a warrant. If they do conduct a home search without a warrant, a defense attorney can get thrown out any evidence that they find in that home because they conducted it in violation of people's constitutional rights. You can't you can't take what applies in criminal law and just put it on DCF and say, oh, look, same thing. I can just refuse. It's not. DCF operates with different rules than the criminal system. Less protections, more power. Less protections, more power is kind of the bottom line I want to have for folks. So they do need people's consent, though. They can't just barge into your house, right? So they say I need to come and make an appointment for, they'll call it a home visit. I need to do a home visit. I just need to look around and I just need to say that I did it. It's part of our protocol. You'll hear it described in a very kind of routine fashion. But, a lot of attorneys in my field are kind of pushing back on this and saying, the way we treat home searches with respect to criminal law, we should really apply some of those same principles with respect to the searches conducted by other government agents, including DCF. We don't have the big ticket cases like the criminal lawyers have to advance those arguments. But it's definitely an active point of advocacy going on in this community. And tied in with that is a push for people to have a Miranda-like warning. And everyone knows pretty much what Miranda is, but a Miranda-like warning for these cases as well. And that's actually happening in Texas now. And if the DCF worker doesn't give the Miranda-like warning for that involvement, saying you don't have to cooperate with us, you have a right to an attorney, et cetera, if they don't give that warning and the parent says something, they can get it thrown out in court. So we are starting to see some applications of those similar principles, but it hasn't reached Massachusetts yet. You absolutely 1010% have the right to know the allegations against you. They will not tell you who filed the report. Usually, if it's a mandated reporter, it's pretty easy to figure out. Because while they'll redact the name of the person, they'll say such and such works at the school with the child. Is a treating provider and saw the kid on XYZ date. So it's usually pretty easy to figure out. Sometimes in the medical context, it's a little more complicated because, if the doctor filing a report, they'll have the nurse do it or the social worker in their office and not them directly. So sometimes it's a little murky. But you absolutely have a right to know exactly what's in that report and have it read word for word. They're not going to give folks a copy, which I think is ridiculous, but they're not going to give people an actual copy of the report, but they will read it word for word, and people should request that. The little asterisk says next to this is, always remember, this is outside of court involvement. If DCF goes to court and has a court order, you're in a different ballgame. You're now at risk of being contempt of court, risk of much more serious sanctions if you do not follow court orders. So that's a whole different ballgame. I'm talking about out-of-court DCF involvement. Go ahead, Brianne. All right, after this slide, I'm going to pause for some questions because these are pretty much the juicy slides usually where I get some good questions. So people can also refuse to let DCF interview or examine the children. So one thing that's really kind of harmful, and people who've experienced this system as children talk about even as adults, is being physically examined by DCF, asking to take off their clothes and strip down to their underwear so that DCF can check for marks and bruises. And that can be a really traumatic traumatizing and traumatic are the same thing, but traumatizing experience for a child. So parents can say, no, DCF, I don't agree for you to interview my child. If you want to do that is a separate question, goes back to my main point at the very beginning of my presentation. This is not legal advice, so I can't say what's right for anyone's specific situation. But that's one of those kind of, you're pushing the power boundaries with DCF, right? Like if you want them to show that they have the power to interview your child, they will show you that they have the power to interview your child. So while that's kind of a right that you can say, I don't give permission, sometimes they just go to the school and they just talk to the child with or without your permission. And there's no real consequences for them because they're conducting an investigation. They have the cover to do that. You can refuse to discuss private information not relevant to the report. So DCF will ask standard questions in every investigation, and they'll explain it as such, like, we ask these questions. They're standard for every parent or every person who's being investigated. And it's about, history of mental health, history of substance use issues. If the report is about your kid not having a winter coat on a cold day, do you have the right to refuse to answer questions, about mental health or about trauma or about involvement with DCF as a child? They will go deep. They will go deep into people's history and kind of rattle off a series of questions. In some ways, it's kind of a gotcha, like, oh, what if I find out later that you actually do have a substance use history, or you actually are in therapy for, depression and anxiety or whatever it may be. So there's kind of like, an analysis there to be like, okay, is it more helpful to refuse, or is it more helpful to resist? To cooperate and give over that information. The point I want to make really and emphasize here is that giving over that information, you're giving over information and evidence about yourself that they could use against you voluntarily. So think about it in that frame of like, okay, I'm voluntarily providing this information in the hopes it's going to lead to them understanding my situation and unsupporting and not finding me to have abused or neglected my child. But there's also the risk that it could go the other way, where they use that information as evidence for why you've abused or neglected your child. So it's a both and situation. One thing that's really important to know about DCF is that you can refuse to sign or limit releases of information, and be very wary of when they put in front of anyone a blank release, meaning the release doesn't say who is the information, doesn't say like the hospital has to release this information. It's just sign here, I'll fill in that part later. That release could be duplicated 10,000 times over. And all of a sudden DCF has full releases for any providers. So if you want to go to the next, so I'm going to pause here like I promised, because you want to go back, actually, I'll get into this, but if you just want to go back to that slide, I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions.
We do have a question in the chat.
Oh, awesome. Let me look. Can a parent tell the school that they do not give permission for a child to speak to DCF? Yes, they can tell the school, I do not give permission. What comes from that is going to be seen. Will DCF, usually what they'll say is, if you refuse to give me permission to talk to your child, I'm going to have to do what's called a legal consult. I'm going to have to talk to the DCF lawyer about escalating the case to potential court involvement. So that's usually kind of like, it'll go up the chain before it gets to the lawyer. Like they'll talk to the supervisor, who'll talk to the manager, who then make a decision about if they're going to talk to the lawyer. So there's some layers in between. But if you start refusing any access to your child, depending on what the allegations are, any access to your child, to your home, you're really increasing the likelihood that there'll be a legal consult and increasing the potential for court involvement. Any other questions? DCF will make allegations. Well, a mandated reporter will make allegations sometimes against one person, sometimes against multiple people. In the course of their investigation, if DCF just gets information in their investigation that they believe, somebody else has done something, if it was originally a report about one parent, they're going to add on that second parent to the report, and they're going to add on a separate allegation. They themselves are going to do that. So it's not always somebody else filing the report. It could be DCF themselves saying, we've got some piece of information in this investigation that's caused us to add on another allegation. So I know that's not entirely responsive, but it is very common that DCF, in the context of removal cases, will kind of say, this parent has done this, but like this parent, we have concerns for this, and this reason. And those reasons may not be enough for that parent not to have custody, but they'll kind of like use kind of the whole situation as one situation versus looking at each parent individually. And that does oftentimes have a huge bias against fathers and fathers assuming custody. I see a question in the chat. Can they force parents to sign adoption papers before the judge's decision? Again, I'll just speak in very general terms about that. Forcing, if somebody has to sign paperwork by force, is usually a very specific question the judge will ask before they approve any sort of agreement or some proposal for an agreement. So just on basic kind of like contract law, judges are going to be asking, did anyone force you to sign this? Now, can DCF create a situation where parents feel pressured and highly pressured to sign things? Absolutely. 110%. And I see it all the time. Because a lot is hanging in the balance and they have a lot of power. Any other questions before I move on to the next slide? Okay, so we'll have more time at the end, but I want to get to fair hearing and kind of talking about what's after an investigation. So moving right along, if you want to go to the next slide, Brian, thank you. I want to underscore and emphasize and highlight and, really color in with Sharpie the point about releases, because during the investigation phase, DCF technically does not need releases. And people are often like, what are you talking about? Of course they need releases. Like I have a therapist. They need, a release to talk to my therapist. Or I have a doctor. They need a release to get my information from my doctor. Of course, my doctor is not just going to give them any information about me. Well, unfortunately, there is a part of the law that we have on the books set, and I put the law on the left-hand side of this slide, chapter 51B, section M, that says that notwithstanding, meaning that aside from any law that says you have a right to kind of those privileged confidential communications, if DCF is calling a mandated reporter, asking them questions, it says very clearly the mandated reporter shall ask questions and provide information to the department, whether or not that person is the person who filed it. So it doesn't have to be the mandated reporter who filed it. If they're calling a doctor who's a mandated reporter, they're calling a therapist who's a mandated reporter, they're calling any other school professional who's a mandated reporter, those people are required under this law to kind of leave all of those confidentiality and privileges and all these other things aside and hand over information to DCF. So it's a pretty big exception to a lot of the protections that we have for folks. But I want to really emphasize that is only in the phase of investigation. That does not apply to after investigation or long-standing involvement with DCF, assessment phase, or other phases of DCF involvement. That is only in the short window, that 5 working days or 15 working days. After that, they need folks to sign releases for providers if they're going to remain involved in the family. And on the right-hand side, you'll see that's the general release of information they have. And the first line, it says that you give permission for the agency named below to share and provide any and all information, including written documentation, to DCF. So if you check that box, that's like an any and all information. That's be a full release. I would see very limited reason why people should be signing a full release. As you go down, checkbox number 3, all information as described in the following. So that's where people can, what we term as limited release. They can specify what information DCF can share and what information the agency or provider can share. So people can limit, like, I only want you to know that I go to therapy. I don't want you to know what I say in therapy. Mm-hmm. Examples like that. Obviously, this is one point where it's helpful to consult with lawyers to kind of see, like, okay, like, I want to limit the information. Like, DCF is constantly talking to my providers. I don't feel like I can talk to my therapist anymore because they just go and tell everything to DCF. It doesn't feel like a safe space anymore. DCF's always calling them and getting information. You can see why, like, this kind of breaks down, a lot of the relationships that people have with providers, who even supportive providers, because DCF can really kind of get into those relationships for information. All right, next slide. What is abuse or neglect? So I just have this slide here because oftentimes we're using these terms, and DCF actually has written definitions for these terms, right? Like, when I said at the beginning, people think like abuse is like very specific, extreme, like you're breaking a child's bone or you're like hurting them in some way that leaves marks, or like really kind of like extreme forms of abuse. This is what these are the definitions. So abuse is a non-accidental act by a caregiver which causes or creates a substantial risk of physical or emotional injury or sexual abuse to a child. So there's a substantial risk element to that in the definition. So you could see how a report could be unsupported, or the person would be found not to have abused their child if it didn't reach the level of substantial risk. That there was some abuse, but it didn't reach substantial risk. And then the definitions for neglect, as defined by DCF, are failure by a caretaker. That doesn't have to be intentional. It could be by neglect or by negligence, to provide a child with minimally adequate food, clothing, shelter, medical care, supervision, emotional stability and growth, or other essential care. But that can't be only due to an inadequate economic resources, which means poverty, or existence of a handicapping condition. So what we know is that a lot of folks, we know this from the statistics we reviewed earlier, are getting caught up in DCF for neglect, for the first one. The most of the people are getting caught up in DCF for neglect. And where we see a lot of reports is under emotional stability and growth. That's where DCF will say, even like parents who've been the victims of domestic violence or survivors of domestic violence are even so, they're neglectful because they've allowed their child to be exposed to domestic violence, and they've failed to protect their child, which impacted their emotional stability and growth. Therefore they are neglectful. Being like, if you look at the basic definition of neglect, minimally adequate food, clothing, shelter, medical care, those are all clearly related to conditions of poverty, right? And it says, like, we can't just support based on that condition of poverty. Well, how DCF gets around that, and you'll see this in reports, is they'll say, well, yeah, like, we see that these people are, living in poverty, they lack resources, and we also have these other concerns which are causing us to support. They don't give people the out that the actual definition allows, which is that inability can't be solely due to inadequate economic resources. Okay, next slide. Any questions about these definitions or how they play out?
I see a question in the chat about DV victims do not report due to DCF.
I just want to co-sign that statement and validate that statement, because I think that's really common. Part of the program I work in here at the Family Justice Clinic is a medical legal partnership where we represent survivors of domestic violence in family law issues. So we see a lot of those cases, and that's very true. And that's been one of the biggest critiques of having this mandated reporting framework and having this really policing function and punitive function of DCF, is that it's driving people away from the very help we say we want them to get, right? Like, people know people are mandated reporters, so if they go and disclose, I'm in a domestic violence situation and like things are feeling really unsafe, they know, and people in the community do know, that could risk them getting their kids taken away. So I think that's right. And we see there's a lot of evidence for that. There's been several, not that it matters, people's lives are evidence, but there are studies as well, and kind of all that scientific research to back that up as well. So I just want to talk a little bit about what happens after the investigation. So after all those steps are done that we went over, DCF's going to come up with their determination. They are going to make a decision about the allegation. And the possible decisions they make or determination are support, substantiated concern, and unsupport. You are going to get, or you or whoever it is who was alleged to have done something is going to get a letter, and it's going to say exactly what it looks like on the right-hand side. What the allegation, the child's name, what the allegation was, what the decision was, and who was responsible for whatever the allegation was. The standard that DCF is using during this process is called reasonable cause to believe. Reasonable cause to believe, based on all the information they collect in their investigation, that there's enough evidence, remember, this is about evidence, enough evidence that there's been a supported allegation of neglect or abuse, substantiated concern that there's not enough for us to say for sure there's reasonable cause that there was abuse or neglect. There's enough for us to be concerned about this family, so we're going to put them in the middle category. Or it just doesn't rise to the level, even at a reasonable cause standard, so we're going to unsupport. So this is a very important letter, because if you do not get this letter at the end of your DCF involvement, you don't know anything about your appellate rights. And your right to appeal DCF's determination. And sometimes that's just sloppiness by DCF. They just don't give people the letters. They don't send them out. But where it shows up is then, somebody goes to apply to become a daycare provider. And they run a DCF background check. And they're like, well, you can't become a daycare provider because you have a support decision on your record. And the parent's like, what? What are you talking about? And they're like, well, have you ever been involved with DCF? They're like, well, yeah, a long time ago they came, there was this crazy situation and, but nothing happened, nothing, they closed it. And I'll often hear people use those words. They closed it. So they closed it. They could have supported and closed, which means it ends up on your record, your DCF Central Registry record. So just because they closed it, those are fewer, DCF doesn't often support and close, but that does happen. Had it happen in one of my cases right now. And so that person has a record with DCF, but they never got the letter, so they didn't know that they could have appealed that. Similar situations happen all the time. Even when people know that they've been supported on, they still, the registry still exists, right? But they never knew that they could have appealed and filed for what's called a fair hearing. So that's the next section we're going to get into is fair hearings. So we were talking about, we're going to cover from 51A to fair hearing. So now we're going to explain a little bit about what a fair hearing is and what it isn't. So I'm going to let Brianne take it away.
Hi, so fair hearing, you essentially have the right to request the fair hearing after the substantiated concern or support decision has been released. And you haven't been able to do that for substantiated concern for a very long time. This is only if the decision has came out past May 30th, 2023. And you have to make sure that you request that hearing before 30 days after you receive your decision, whether that be by mail, email, or online. And the reason that it's so important to make sure that you are appealing this is because this is your only opportunity to contest this type of support decision. And this decision is what's going to end up making sure that you are on the central registry. And as someone mentioned in the chat, the central registry stays there for 75 years. So it's a really important thing for you to do. And in terms of requesting a fair hearing, you can do that through e-file, or you can do that online. Or you could do that through a written request. And if you do it through the e-file, it'll come up with a form just like the one that you see on the right. You just fill out that form, and you should be all set for submission of your request. So what happens in a fair hearing? Who are the people that are involved? The fair hearing officer is an employee of DCF, but they claim to be impartial. And what that means is that they were not involved in your case, and they are not involved in investigations, period. The only thing that they are involved with is fair hearings. So they get to deal with the results of investigations when people are saying, hey, these results don't seem like they match up to what happened. Where are fair hearings? Those hearings are held virtually via Zoom or via Teams. And what are these fair hearings? The impartial, once again, DCF fair hearing officer will listen to testimony from DCF where they explain how the investigation was done properly. And then after hearing the officer talk about how the investigation was done perfectly, you now get to speak about the concerns that you have about DCF's investigation. And so when you're talking about the concerns that you have to make sure that you prove the things that can allow a fair hearing officer to recommend the reversing of this determination. So you have to prove either that DCF violated a statute, which is just a law, and then you have to prove if there's no applicable statute, so if there's no law that's related to the way that DCF was acting, then you have to prove that they failed to act reasonably and that unreasonableness resulted in substantial prejudice to the person who's filing the appeal. And this is something that is a little bit more rare because DCF usually is acting within statute, so you have to point to the statute and say that they did not follow that statute. Another way that you could get the fair hearing officer to recommend reversing this determination is by saying that there's no reasonable cause to believe that the child has been abused or neglected. And you can also say that there is no substantial evidence that you are responsible for the abuse or the neglect. But after the fair hearing officer makes their decision, the commissioner has to approve their decision. So no matter if you convince the fair hearing officer, the commissioner still has the final decision to decide whether or not to permit the determination. And it's really important to understand your rights in these fair hearings. You do have the right to legal representation, which means that you can be represented by an attorney. The attorney won't be provided for you, but you are authorized to get an attorney and to get an authorized representative. And you also have the right to have witness testimony. So you can have witnesses come and support your case as well. And you have rights to document presentation. So any documents that you believe are related to the case, any videos, any sort of information that you have access to, this is something that you have the right to present and you should present. You also have the right to access your DCF file. And in accessing your DCF file, that includes 51A and B reports and any provider records, including any notes from the investigation. So the interpreter and accommodations is another thing that you have a right to. So if you need an interpreter or have some accommodations that need to be in place for you to be able to fully participate in the fair hearing, you do have the right for that. And that's something that you can request with the fair hearing officer. And you also have the right to subpoena. So you have the right to subpoena individuals and documents from DCF or outside of DCF to provide testimony or evidence. So if there is someone who DCF did not speak to who you think would be really helpful in proving your case, you have the right to ask the DCF fair hearing officer to subpoena them so that you can talk to them in front of the fair hearing officer about the relevant testimony that they have. Awesome. Does anyone have any questions about fair hearings?
Yes. There's some questions in the chat. Why does DCF show up to the fair hearings with nothing, yet parents show up with documents and stuff, and it still goes in DCF's favor?
Great question. So oftentimes folks come wanting to just tell their side of the story, right? Like to say, give more context, give more background. Sometimes folks haven't even actually ever seen the 51B report. They just, say, I requested my appeal, my fair hearing appeal, and I'm going to show up and I'm going to give my side of the story. I think what we're trying to outline about the fair hearing process, and the reason we're kind of in this space providing access to legal representation and legal information about fair hearings, is that there's actually a lot more tools in people's toolbox that a lot of folks don't know they can exercise. And getting all of this information is critical, right? So as soon as possible, once the fair hearing is granted, you get the date for the fair hearing, start making your requests. You want to see what that 51B says. If you're going into the fair hearing not having ever seen what the 51B says, you are at a severe disadvantage. The fair hearing officer will have it. The DCF person representative is going to come and talk all about it. The 51B document is what's going to really kind of rule your whole strategy. How are you going to poke holes in what they did or didn't do? So number one, if you haven't seen that, it's going to be really hard, really, really hard to do that and be successful in the hearing. People also aren't aware that all of these things that DCF is supposed to do during the investigation, when we say DCF violated their policies or violated the law, they're governed by the law, they're governed by regulation, and they're governed by policies. So there's many layers of things that kind of apply to them. And part of a lawyer's job, right, is to go through all those layers of things and figure out what applies to your situation, make a legal argument. Obviously, we know folks aren't all lawyers, but the policies are on their website. You can look through their policy. Say you gave them a list of people to contact who were going to help your case, and they didn't contact any of those people, right? That shows that the report was biased. They were only following their leads and just discounting anything you had to offer. So there are strategies. One really huge, powerful piece of the fair hearing process is the ability to DCF is the one who sends the orders out for production of documents or for ordering people to show up at the hearing. So you don't have to pay for that. You don't have to send it out yourself. They do that. So if you say, I want this doctor to show up at the hearing, they'll send out the subpoena for that. If you say, I want these medical records, they'll send out the subpoena for that. Usually it's just an email to the paralegal who's assigned to dealing with the case saying, these are my requests. These are the pieces of information I think are going to be helpful. And then you get those pieces of information. You look at those pieces of information to see whether or not those are helpful, right? What if you get records, you're looking at them and you're like, actually, this doesn't help my case at all. These people totally didn't get it either. Or they were super biased towards DCF. And if I give over this information, it's just going to make me look worse. So these are often decisions we as lawyers make all the time. We'll get a bunch of information about our client's case and we'll look at it and go this helps, this doesn't help so much. We wouldn't just hand over everything. We're going to hand over the pieces that help, not the ones that don't help. So there's a lot of strategy involved in fair hearings, and why it's important to do is that, DCF history is cumulative, like we talked about at the beginning. It kind of lasts forever. And even if, we say about central registry and you can come off central registry and all these things, in reality, the central registry is just their case management system. So your history always will live there. It really is never going away, quite frankly. And they can always access it for their purposes of considering you as a kinship placement or considering you as, any sort of provider for children. They're always going to be able to see things. And, it's your only opportunity. If you don't appeal at this point, when you get the letter and your appellate rights, that opportunity vanishes. And it's a very short window. You only have 30 days to request. But like I said, when you didn't get the letter, we've just got a hearing granted. The person didn't get the letter in 2015. She's getting a hearing in February because she never got the letter. Sometimes it does. It really depends on the type of check that the school or any sort of providers are doing. The depth of the check, if it's just a query, right? A query is a criminal record check. So oftentimes DCF history doesn't show up in that. But a DCF check, it's called an Adam Walsh records check. It will show up in that. And so, yes, so this is kind of some of the reasons why people do seek these appeals and, for privileged people, hire lawyers and really vigorously contest them, because it does impact kind of their ability to do child-facing things. I'm just going to look in the chat to see if there's any questions here. Court-related things. You can go and sit in divorce court. You can go sit in criminal court and see what's going on there. Can't do that in juvenile court, right? Like, nobody can sit there and find out. Nobody, meaning like reporters can't. Nobody really knows what goes on behind closed doors in juvenile court. So I think like that's one of the things of points of advocacy in the kind of advocacy community is advocating for open courts, and that we need to kind of get these courts to be examined to see like who is being favored, who are decisions going for, are judges actually following the law. The argument for keeping them closed is that it protects people's privacy, but the argument against is that like bad things happen in the darkness, and if people don't have access to researching and exposing and bringing to light some of DCF's misdeeds, we're going to keep having horrible results. And then I just see one other question. Hey, change your DCF worker before court all the time. It's like starting all over again. That is horrible. And I agree that there's a lot of setbacks as a result of staffing changes. No surprise, they can't retain social workers for a very long time because it's a very hard job, I think. And it's also, good people won't stay. I'll put it that way, in my opinion. Good people will leave because, a lot of people get into the work because they want to help people, and they get to DCF and realize, like, wait a minute, these people aren't in the business of helping people. So that's incredibly frustrating. But yes, I think there is a lot of turnover that causes delays in people's cases. Another question? No, you can't. You can't. And yes, there are court watching programs in other states and other places. And I think that's one of the reasons, as you can see, the reason to have a court watching program is to keep people accountable, right? To keep an eye on what's going on in courts and what's going on in systems that taxpayers fund. And, are they doing what they say they're doing? And what we know is DCF is not doing a lot of what they say they're doing. If you actually read what DCF is responsible for doing, a lot of what they have in writing sounds wonderful. We're supporting and strengthening families. We're giving them all the resources they need to be strong families and remain together and all these things. The vast majority of interactions that I've observed with DCF, that families have had with DCF, and what we're hearing from people who've been through these systems, and some of you in this Zoom, is that is not the experience of folks with these systems. They're not getting the things they need out of the system. They're not getting direct income support. They're not getting housing. They're not getting shelter and respite from a domestic violence situation. They're not getting even support, like basic support. Like, I see you're struggling. They're getting punishment. They're getting parenting evaluations. They're getting parenting classes. They're getting drug screens. They're getting monitored. They're getting surveilled. They're getting punished. If they have an infraction, they're getting punished some more. Kids are getting harmed. They're being taken out of their communities and put into pre-adoptive homes that, are being paid to take care of them. So I could go on and on about my politics about this, but I think you can see my angle. And yeah, to the point of your comments in the chat, a lot of people do experience it as a very traumatic system that is also multi-generational, that we see families who've had DCF involvement, then the next generation has a DCF involvement. It's like a cyclical expectation almost that DCF is going to be involved in their family. And part of what I'm thinking about as an advocate, obviously not someone with lived experience, is how can we disrupt this? How can we break this cycle of involvement with DCF? How can we call it out for how it is? Thank you so much for coming, Karen. So yeah, I think this is like having Zooms like this and bringing people together and really giving voice. I want to say not to people like me and advocates, but giving voice and platforms and opportunities for people who've experienced the system to speak out. And we've seen that, the Boston Globe hasn't historically been a great newspaper to cover DCF, but there's a new reporter there who's been doing a much better job, and the kind of article I pointed to that came out last week. If you look it up and look at the little video, there's better reporting going on to change people's minds about DCF. And we'll go through a few more resources in a second about learning more about the system. But I just want to make sure we cover any questions before I talk about learning more. Any other questions? Okay, great. So I just want to go back to kind of like, is there legal help? Like, I want a fair hearing, or my friend or my loved one had a 51A found on them and it was supported and they want to appeal, but they want help. Like, I see that it's involved and there's more to it than just explaining your side of the story. That is help that we provide. So Kayla will have our information. You have obviously my email if you got the Zoom link. We are providing access to legal representation for folks for fair hearings. So actually giving you, in our case, a student attorney who's under the supervision of someone like me, an attorney, to actually represent you in the fair hearing and to do some of those legal tasks that we talked about, like getting documents, evaluating them, getting witnesses, developing a strategy. Because let me just put it this way, DCF is running a game on people. They have their game down. They know what they're doing, right? They have their game down. They got the policies. They got it all laid out about what they're doing. But folks on the other side need to have their strategy too. And it can't be just, oh, I'm going to, give wide-ended open access to DCF and they're going to understand me. I can just assure you that that strategy is often one that is not successful. Sometimes it is, but often it is not. So we'll circulate this flyer. You'll get it. And I just want to go forward. If you want to kind of learn more, or back one, sorry, learn more about the origins of family policing and how we came to have a system that is intent on punishing parents instead of supporting them, I really recommend to you these two books by an author and professor. Her name's Dorothy Roberts. She wrote a book 20 years ago called Shattered Bonds, which was about kind of the child welfare system and its disproportionate impacts on communities of color, especially women of color. She was particularly researching in Chicago. But she wrote a follow-up book just a few years ago called Torn Apart, calling for the abolition of the family policing system. Both of these books are great resources. You can find them at your local library, I'm sure, or Amazon or wherever. And on the next slide, I'm just going to share two more kind of activist type hubs in this space. One is called Movement for Family Power. They are a national kind of activism organization that is leading a lot of some of the calls for change and also amplifying the voices of people who've been impacted. They have a great campaign about drug tests not being parenting tests, and informed consent for drug testing in medical settings. So not just automatically drug testing at birth, but having to require informed consent. And that's their some of their handles. And then the next one is one that is my personal favorite, which is called Just Make a Change for Families. It's run by the woman in green. If you can see in the picture in front, her name is Joyce McMillan. She's a very, very, very outspoken parent activist out of New York, but she, goes around the country, who had her children removed over 20 years ago, and now really speaks out in a very, pointed, direct, upfront way about the harms of this system. She is an amazing activist and advocate for explaining how this system primes children to participate in the system of mass incarceration in this country. And she does some, if you ever see her speak or just Google her or look on YouTube for speeches she's given or talks she's given, she has a great description. Well, it's sad, but like apt description of like, in foster care, children are told to eat what they're provided. They're told their meal times. They're, moved around from home to home, carrying their belongings in a trash bag. They're told that they can only see their parents 1 hour once a week. Very similar in a supervised setting, very similar to a lot of the ways that we treat people in incarceration. And there's a lot of really kind of vivid parallels. And she also speaks a lot to how, taking a child away from their family touches all of their senses. Like all 5 senses are impacted, what they smell, what they eat, what they hear. Like their whole community has been taken away from them. It's not just their parents or their caregiver. It's more than that. So I just really recommend her to folks for a follow, or she's involved in many different campaigns in this space, and a big proponent of the Miranda family Miranda, and also to reframe and reconfigure mandated reporting into a mandated supporting. She actually coined that term. So anyways, those are just some, like, on a hopeful note, like there is activism going on in this space. There are people out front who have been impacted, who are using their voices and gathering people together, just like Kayla's doing with PFA. So I just want to make sure I give some airtime to Kayla and make sure you can talk about the work of PFA as well.
Hi guys. Yep, I'm Kayla Baladron. So PFA, we are again a nonprofit organization based in Worcester. We serve Worcester County. We have a family interconnection peer program where we provide parents who are involved with DCF with a peer parent advocate. And what we do is we provide parents with transportation to their appointments. We provide transportation to courts, to visits, anything that's DCF related. And we also go with them physically to their appointments, medical appointments, court hearings, visitations, foster care reviews, team meetings. We go to all of those in support of the parent. We also provide our Munchel Meal program, providing healthy meals and snacks and beverages to parents who are going to visit their children. And we also provide our office space as a private one-on-one community visit space for parents who are having community visits, whether supervised or unsupervised, at our office. All of our services is free. There's no charge. And we also provide wraparound services. So if parents need resources for substance use or for food, we have our wraparound services where we will guide our parents to resources in their communities. And then we also do a lot of advocating. So we go to like the State House and we advocate on different bills that's affecting parents. Another thing that we do is we have our weekly support groups. So parents can come and vent, get advice from other parents. And one of the really major components to our organization is that none of us are mandated reporters. So therefore, parents can actually be transparent with us, even if they have a DCF case, where we can actually help them with getting on the right track if they're not on that right track. And we are just there for the parents to get their kids home. We also go to investigations as well. So if a parent is being investigated by DCF and they know that DCF's coming out on this date and this time, because normally I like to tell my parents, if DCF comes to your home unannounced, you can tell them that you do not want them to come in, that you can make an appointment and to come back to see me, my kids. So that way it gives the parent enough time to get their support system put in place, whether it's me or if it's their therapist or in-home therapy, whoever they have on their team can be there during those investigations. So we do that as well. And then we also help parents who aren't involved with DCF, who are not being investigated, but are at risk of being involved with DCF, which could mean anything. Could mean just living in poverty, just being homeless, going through domestic violence, just struggling mentally and emotionally. So we try to get involved with parents to get them resources and services put in place that will avoid DCF from getting involved. So I don't know if anyone wants to ask any questions or want more info. We do have our website. We're on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Our office is right here in Worcester at 900 Main Street, Suite B. It's on the bus route, and the buses are free, so it's very easy transportation. We're very easy to access. If parents need help with anything, we don't want to be a barrier. We want to help the parents overcome those barriers. So we're always there to support.
And I just want to give a shout out to Kayla and like growing this from a seed of an idea. And I know Tiffany's here too, and your team. You know, I think it's so crucial that folks have safe spaces to turn to, where they're not going to feel like they're going to get reported on, and that they can actually go and be vulnerable and get the support they need. So I just want to give you your flowers and your team's flowers today to say, like, I see you. I think the work you're doing is amazing. And that I hope, you know, the funding will come, right, to support it some more, because I know this is a lot of labor as well, and that it will just continue to grow, because the dream really for us legal advocates too is to work in a team approach, like to work in a team with a social worker of our own and a parent advocate. So that's my dream. That's kind of the gold standard legal practice in this space too, is to make sure we're not just working in silos, that we're working in community with each other. We're building stronger networks for folks to turn to that are, you know, actually going to be supportive and not punitive like DCF. So thank you all for coming. If you do link, I'm happy to circulate those and, you know, spread the word. We're happy to do these presentations too for other groups. If you're involved with other groups, we definitely want to get the word out that there are rights when people are involved with DCF. And it's you know, tricky about when to exercise those rights and when to push back, but hopefully also connect folks with legal help as well.
Yes.
So everyone have a great night. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.